communicating with others. It might not be very obvious to you because I'm intelligent and I seem to have a way with words. I think that's the hardest part about living in my mind. People expect a lot from me, and when I don't understand something or I don't know how to do something, they think I'm choosing not to. My art, though, is one way I find I'm able to communicate with others, and these days it's my primary form of communication. However, for a very large part of my life, I also used self-injury. I wanted to communicate so badly that I was not okay and I needed help that I was willing to pay the price of my own blood. The worst part is it never worked. I was first diagnosed with a mental illness when I was 14. I spent over 10 years in therapy and have been admitted to 6 different psychiatric hospitals. Because of my mistreatment both in the mental health system and in society, I've dedicated my life to advocating mental illness awareness to fight stigma by sharing my own story. Despite how far back in history treatment of mental illness dates, very little progress has been made in how it's viewed and treated in society today. Prior to the development of psychotropic drugs, treatment of mental illness was cruel. In 1949, these drugs were introduced, which led to a large deinstitutionalization movement. Unfortunately, in many ways, this created more problems for those suffering. Today, very little has changed. To go into further detail, prior to the development of psychotropic drugs, treatment of mental illness was cruel. According to a research paper written by Alison Forshner, treatments date as far back as 5000 BC and up until around the Middle Ages was mostly believed to be caused by evil and spirits and demons. Therefore, treatment relied heavily upon religious rituals such as exorcisms for a cure. For the most part, those suffering were left to the care of their families where they were kept hidden. Once the Middle Ages came, treatment took a serious turn for the worse with the development of asylums, which first began to appear in 1407. These asylums stayed in existence until as late as the late 1900s, well within all of our lifetime. Asylums were cruel. According to Forshner, patients were often chained with metal shackles and kept in tiny dark cells where they were completely isolated and irregularly fed. Their illnesses were rarely treated, and when they were, it was usually through bloodletting using leeches or purging using laxatives. Reforms of the asylums began in the 1800s, but were short-lived due largely to biomedical advances, including the performance of lobotomies in the 1930s. Lobotomies, as you can see here, was when a doctor would insert an ice pick-like tool through a patient's eye socket into the brain to damage it, believed to cure the patient. Needless to say, treatment was cruel. In 1949, according to a timeline of mental illness published by PBS, was the introduction of psychotropic drugs, which led to a large deinstitutionalization movement. Unfortunately, in many ways, this created more problems for those suffering. By 1980, the number of patients in psychiatric hospitals had dropped greatly. Unfortunately, many of these patients ended up homeless as a result of inadequate housing and poor follow-up support. Also in the 1980s, the timeline estimated that 1/3 of the homeless population had a severe mental illness. Jail reports from 1992 estimate that 7% of the incarcerated had a severe mental illness. Many of them there without charges, simply waiting for a bed at a psychiatric hospital. That brings us to today. Today, very little has changed. Research from the Treatment Advocacy Center showed that there was a decrease in state psychiatric hospital beds of 14% from 2005 to 2010 when there were large mental health budget cuts, showing that as a society we are taking steps back in history in how we view and treat mental illness. Statistics provided by the National Alliance on Mental Illness show that 46% of adults living in homeless shelters today have a severe mental illness, and that 20% of state prisoners have a recent history of a mental health condition. In conclusion, prior to the development of psychotropic drugs, treatment of mental illness was cruel. Once these drugs were introduced, there was a large deinstitutionalization movement, which led to many of those suffering to become homeless as a result of poor follow-up support. Today, very little has changed. Despite how far back in history treatment of mental illness dates, very little progress has been made in how it's viewed and treated in society today. When I was first kicked out of the house, when I was 17, I lived with this couple who duct taped me to a bed one night to restrain me. A year later, I was sleeping on this guy's couch, and I cut too deep one night. I couldn't make it stop bleeding. At the emergency room, I was left alone in a bed as blood pooled around me. Eventually, a doctor came in, stapled me shut without numbing me first, and then told me I could leave. At my last psychiatric hospital stay, I cut one night. I just didn't know what else to do, and the nurse on duty stuck me in isolation for the rest of the night. My body worked itself up so badly I had to be medicated just so I could sleep. As if that wasn't bad enough, the next day the entire staff ignored me until just before bed when they gave me a hug and told me I did a good job not acting out. I've been thrown to the ground by a police officer, had my head smashed into the cold hard ground as I was handcuffed and then roughly thrown into the back of a police car. For no other reason than my body, it froze, and my inability to comply with what was being asked of me was seen as defiant. If you think for one moment that we've made much progress in how we view and treat mental illness, you are wrong. But I believe there is hope. As long as people like me continue to have the courage to speak out and share their stories, there is hope for change. And I want to communicate that hope to the world, so I leave with you 1,000 words in my own language.